We hear a lot of a coming transition that's unfolding across the world. Usually, the term is used in relation to renewable and sustainable energy, the so called green transition. But it's also been applied to ideas like a monetary transition or reset, a technological transition, which includes AI and robotics, as well as major shifts in social structure, ranging from local government to large-scale geopolitics. It may be that many disparate topics du jour have been strung along under the vague transition umbrella, or perhaps it's true that many such paradigm shifts are taking place concurrently. This chapter is therefore aptly named both to play on the popular rhetoric invoking feelings of transition, but importantly, to more precisely identify areas of transition and from what angles we might approach the relevant challenges. The transition to renewable energy began as a solution for reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. For clarity, I use the term renewable here to refer primarily to wind and solar, and the category usually includes hydropower and geothermal, but more on that later. First, if we assume the climate is on the brink of catastrophe, as some contend, you'd be a monster not to do everything possible to expedite the green transition. But regardless of your position on climate, it would be wise to at least develop a robust mix of energy inputs in the interest of energy security and independence. If the climate scare ends up being less urgent than anticipated, still it won't hurt to get ahead of the problem early, assuming we have the power to impact and influence the environment. And that's all I'll say about climate specifically, because I think there's an interesting conversation to be had through the lens of finance, energy, and technology, with the hope that we can find agreement on what a highly advanced and energy-capable human civilization can look like. There is a recently purported framework that details standards of business conduct along the lines of environmental stewardship, social good, and corporate governance, or what's come to be known as ESG. It's a bit like a stamp of approval that signifies that a company has done its due diligence and is making efforts to adhere to accepted norms in each category. Many businesses recognize the importance of doing social good in their communities and that their commitment to people need not come at the expense of the bottom line. Issues of corporate governance don't appear to dominate the conversation like the other issues, which seems to indicate a general alignment, for better or worse, among industry leaders toward the same ends. Increased transparency at the highest ranks of corporations might be valuable, but it would be worth looking deeper at standards of governance before and after ESG measures are enacted. Environmental sustainability has been a hot topic for some time, and while the topic touches more than just carbon emissions, the main area of contention remains the viability of oil and gas companies as we go forward with investing in renewable energy sources. Without a doubt, fossil fuels have been vilified as the main offender of sustainability, despite the many modern-day achievements going back to the Industrial Revolution. I think we should be careful not to put too much weight on ESG index scores to avoid the temptation to compare apples and oranges. It would be silly to compare the score of an electric vehicle manufacturer with an oil and gas company. Further, if we took the index score as gospel, companies might then be motivated to game the system to achieve a better ranking and forget to evaluate whether their actions are really in line with the values and business goals of their particular organization. Nevertheless, the score has the potential to become a major criterion by which investors and money managers make their allocation decisions, thus leading to greater concentration of assets in the largest names. We've already seen evidence of increased concentration of assets under management due to the wave of passive index fund investing, If every American invested their savings in passive funds, the market as a whole might be more prone to bubbles, and that can never end well. Some amount of passive investing is probably harmless, but to think passive indexing would come to dominate the market is a cause for concern for some analysts. On the bright side, it's likely any fears of herd behavior leading to systemic dysfunction are balanced by an increased interest in active management, thus allowing the pendulum to swing the other way. Cost-conscious investors will usually opt for passive index funds, while for investors who want to add sector or strategy-specific exposure, there's a dizzying array of ETFs to choose from. Fund management fees are generally small and only noticeable to the astute observer, but they add up with increasing assets under management. All this is to say, ESG investing presents managers and advisors an opportunity to sell new groups of funds with essentially the same stock holdings, but charge higher management fees. And for clients and investors, many of whom are unsophisticated, it's implied that we have a moral obligation to participate. The social pressure to show a commitment to sustainability drives more companies to adopt an ESG framework. When more companies get on the bandwagon to reap the social and financial rewards, or otherwise avoid condemnation from the crowd, the prestige of the green label begins to lose its luster and the significance is diluted, creating an effect we call greenwashing. When everything is labeled green, the meaning of the label gets diluted, while the unadulterated concept of sustainability remains relevant. I suspect if and when the ESG label falls out of style, no doubt new rules under new banners will appear that can be used to shape behaviors and opinions. For some time, nuclear has been the energy elephant in the room due to concerns of waste and nuclear accidents, despite its significant potential to create energy abundance. Nuclear fears aren't entirely unfounded, as we've been made viscerally aware of the destructive nature of nukes in the wrong hands. But to wield the power of the atom for power generation at scale would truly be a paradigm shift and indeed a missed opportunity were we to suddenly drop the ball. Among the range of energy inputs, nuclear deserves to be in a category of its own due to its sheer energy density. To put it any other way is an insult to our own intellect and capacity for innovation. But debates over the renewability of nuclear, I argue, are somewhat superficial. By saying that nuclear is not renewable, what we really mean is that rare isotopes of uranium are not renewable, which may be true. But on the whole, nuclear fuel sources are practically inexhaustible due to the inordinate amount of energy extractable from tiny bits of matter. Though today's technology is still relatively nascent, that's not to say greater possibilities won't be engineered in the future. If we're being precise, our own sun isn't renewable because one day the sun will burn up its own nuclear fuel. But of course, that's not how we view solar energy here on Earth, where sunshine is free and abundant. The finite life of the sun may be factually true, but it's practically irrelevant on the timescales we're interested in. Arguing to the contrary is trivial and pedantic. I would apply the same reasoning to nuclear, with the caveat that controlled fission on Earth is obviously not the same as stellar fusion, which leaves the main criticisms of nuclear to be safety and the question of waste disposal. Indeed, the sustainability of nuclear is threatened in the absence of a solution to nuclear waste. I think the issue need not be a deal breaker, but merely represents a new set of challenges which ought to be welcomed if reducing emissions is what we're after. The upside is just too great to ignore. Until the laws of thermodynamics change, it's reasonable to assume that waste in some form will be a byproduct of human life, so it should be possible to be smart and mindful of pollution without being hysterical. For natural and political reasons, it's true uranium is not exactly easy to come by, But it would be naive to assume nuclear power generation will only be viable with one or two fuel types, the other being plutonium. Even if these do remain the preferred nuclear fuel for the near future, I can imagine the untapped potential already present in the world's nuclear weapons arsenals that are otherwise collecting dust. What better way to begin demilitarizing large stockpiles of nukes and instead repurpose that fuel for energy production? That's the kind of human success story that would be nice to tell our grandchildren. It might be helpful to clarify the term renewable and sort of unpack the components of energy generation that we care about. At first approximation, renewable would seem to suggest that an energy source can be replenished at the rate it's being consumed. Another description that I've heard applied to wind and solar is that once the system is operational, there is a zero marginal cost of producing the next unit of power because, of course, wind and sunshine are free. We can think of sources like hydroelectric and geothermal in a similar way, because if you think about it, the Earth is in constant flux. Nothing stands still for long. Energy and motion are the natural way of things. The question is how to tap into that energy on demand and at scale. While energy is part of the story, what we really need is power. That is, the ability to dispatch a quantity of energy in a given time period. In terms of what's physically possible, there's no shortage of energy out there to be utilized. The bottleneck is the speed of innovation and the limits of our own imagination. But even if our electricity needs were met in a radically sustainable way, we've yet to address the natural resource constraints that are in play. Let me explain. We can imagine, briefly, that the surface of the Earth is dotted with wind turbines and solar panels. Imagine that this was enough energy to power all of human activity with plenty to spare. So we've achieved free and abundant electricity, but it turns out that's not enough. The materials for building energy grid infrastructure need to be sourced, and presumably the materials that go into building the grid implies less materials available for use in other projects. Some of these materials are rare earth minerals that are expensive or dangerous to acquire. Some come from the existing petroleum sector, and anything that can't be recycled ends up in landfills, which is the worst of all worlds. Science nerds have a way of succinctly summarizing these observations in the statement that energy flows and matter cycles. With regard to energy, the Earth is an open system, as energy comes in from the sun and also dissipates back into space. However, with regard to matter, the Earth is a closed system, save for the occasional stray meteorite. This means we can only work with the materials that we have here. Matter isn't quite abundant in the sense that energy from solar radiation is abundant, and we can't overlook that. Earth materials exist in finite quantities, which impose limits on the amount of stuff we can build before venturing out into further reaches of the solar system. You can imagine if nuclear energy depended entirely on the Earth's supply of uranium, that might not be very sustainable. But the more we learn to extract energy from already abundant elements, things like hydrogen, lithium, carbon, and silicon, that's at least a step in the right direction. Our future energy mastery will reflect a skill for exploiting physics using the matter all around us. We've seen the effects on the environment of extracting natural resources, and the effects have been mostly destructive to habitats and biodiversity. The harder we press on the system, the greater risk to the biosphere and to our own home. For this reason, renewables may not represent an immediate panacea in which energy is free forever with no side effects. We should be realistic about the material constraints that exist. Investment in renewables often seems like a case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. because we can't afford not to innovate, but doing so may cause pain elsewhere in the ecosystem. Because we can't live without a healthy biosphere, perhaps we should look to the biosphere itself for the solution to energy needs. We might attempt to model energy generation after living systems that have had 1 billion years to iron out the details, such as plants that convert solar energy into chemical bonds, and hopefully add some of our own discoveries along the way. This has been explored in the area of biofuels, which is a field of growing research. I would venture to say many political debates on energy are less concerned with the sustainability merits of major classes of power generation and more a tug of war over government subsidies. People are quick to take sides in the energy debate, and rarely are they willing to compromise. And this usually reflects the underlying incentives at play. It turns out the U.S. subsidizes all the big energy sectors, including renewables, electric vehicles, oil and gas, and to a lesser extent, nuclear and overall efficiency improvements. Naturally, the relative proportions of the subsidies have varied over time, and the largest ones often correspond to periods of heavy development and commercial deployment of new tech. That's all fine. My only concern is that we come to emphasize subsidies more than the broader sustainability goals, and hence miss the forest for the trees. Financial incentives are relevant to the extent they impact quarterly balance sheet metrics and perhaps jobs and compensation. More often than not, the immediate financial needs of people tends to overshadow the long-term goal of saving the planet. Of course, the moral justification for subsidies is that the sooner we transition to renewables, the sooner we can save the planet. And offering particular incentives helps facilitate that. However, what we really mean by subsidies is that large upfront investments in energy infrastructure are financed by government debt, the cost of which is ultimately borne by future taxpayers. You can see why debates over power production can get heated. And the last thing I'll mention here is that the more subsidies in effect, the more hidden externalities of the actual cost of energy as a result of meddling with the price signal. There is a danger of growing complacent around the true costs if subsidies don't eventually find a balance and a level playing field. They can even be anti-competitive in cases where regulations limit market access to only a few large players. If one were to believe fossil fuels needed to be phased out immediately, then why continue subsidizing the industry at all? The answer, I suspect, is that oil and gas are not actually going away. They're just likely to become more expensive, but you already knew that. I find it reasonable to take an all-of-the-above approach to energy policy. Developing a diverse and robust energy mix can help reduce dependence on foreign exports, which we know tends to create tenuous geopolitical situations. It's valuable to invest in solar, wind, and geothermal, etc., because when the sun shines, you can't beat free energy. Though we shouldn't forget that renewables are similar to traditional power plants in that they require the extraction of natural resources to build, which incidentally includes petroleum products, plus ongoing maintenance, so the cost is by no means zero. But even as we continue to ramp up renewables, it would be unwise to shut off the gas before the grid sees a revolution in battery and transmission capabilities. If excess generation is the norm, it would be nice to be able to store it for later. Coal, oil, and natural gas have been the backbone of power generation since day one, and it's because of their unwavering reliability that allows us to keep the lights on. We shouldn't accept decreased power availability and more episodes of blackouts because power companies are stifled by regulation. Imagine hospitals and other life-critical services that can't afford to lose power, as it could literally mean the difference between life and death. In other words, making any sort of energy transition shouldn't mean leaving people out in the cold because we weren't willing to turn on the gas. If reducing emissions means offshoring an equal amount of emissions to other jurisdictions, well, then we haven't actually solved the problem from the Earth's perspective. So it's important to read the fine print on sustainability claims. For reasons of reliability, oil and gas should play an integral part of our energy strategy into the foreseeable future. We all share the goal of human flourishing, and with that comes increasingly novel ways of transforming raw energy into productivity. The path we get there can be multifaceted, and it turns out Bitcoin joins the party at just the right time. With respect to Bitcoin mining and the energy grid, I'm going to try to convey the important information without pretending that I'm an expert in either Bitcoin mining or the grid. However, I maintain that Bitcoin will play a critical role in the energy transition, and here's why. Since the advent of the modern grid, our energy demands have been met by power plants that are made to hum along consistently and reliably. Large power plants take time to spin up and to cool down, so once they're on, it's nice to keep them on. This challenge is magnified by the fact that grid power is a just-in-time supply chain, meaning that a spike in consumer demand needs to be met instantaneously, and also that excess power generation needs to be consumed quickly and nearby, or else it's wasted. Renewables introduce a new set of challenges because while the energy is potentially cheap, it's only intermittent, which means energy supply from those sources is variable and random. Parenthetically speaking, a world where renewables are ubiquitous could potentially see a smoothing out across geographies of what is normally local randomness, but I digress. One problem that arises is that during periods where renewable energy is abundant, gas plants may be forced to turn down to limit excess supply, only to rev back up when renewable supply is low, and this causes undue strain on power plants that are designed to run at a steady pace. We know energy demands from people are variable in nature, but we can't allow the power grid to be equally random in supply. The grid needs to be both responsive to consumer demand and also highly reliable and resilient. Bitcoin helps mitigate the stress of instantaneous demand response, taking some of the load off the shoulders of old power plants, which we depend on for reliability. The mechanism of Bitcoin's effect on the grid is through the process of mining, which is near perfectly efficient and agile when it comes to variable power demands. Bitcoin is an energy buyer of last resort, and this benefits the grid in a few key ways. First, the network acts as a buyer when energy is cheap and abundant, absorbing some of the excess supply that might otherwise be curtailed. Miners can then throttle down when rates for power spike. Next, the network acts as a buyer when no other buyer exists, such as the case of stranded and uneconomic energy assets. Miners are seeking the lowest cost energy, and given the availability of ASICs, will deploy hash wherever electricity can be made or found, regardless of its proximity to the grid. The reward for doing so is, of course, Bitcoin the asset, which is as good as cash in hand. Monetizing wasted or stranded energy is ideal for Bitcoin miners because there's no worry of competing with the energy demands of people. Prior to this arrangement, there was no incentive to explore energy assets for which no buyer existed, or the market was so distant as to be uneconomical to transport the power. Bitcoin mining, therefore, brings the market directly to the source of power generation. Now, you might say, well, what happens to the power itself if it has no way back to the grid where it can be used? Surely I can't heat my home with Bitcoins. And you're right, eventually the grid needs to catch up to disparate energy resources, or the power source can be used to help bootstrap local communities on site. The existence of Bitcoin miners merely facilitates the generation of power from the moment the lights are turned on by paying the producer a sats flow, Notably, if one considers mining with intermittent power sources, the power should be cheap enough, or the project should present other redeeming qualities to offset the opportunity cost of running the servers 24/7 with reliable power. It's only natural that Bitcoin miners would find allies in the energy space, and it's likely those bonds will strengthen as Bitcoin mining becomes vertically integrated with producers. Mining is energy agnostic, modular, and responsive in real time, so it can easily be paired with renewables, nuclear, and fossil fuels. Mining hardware produces no emissions. Its only products are heat and block rewards. The temperature and noise concerns have also inspired creative ways of capturing and repurposing things like heat to create more synergies. Now, is it really desirable for Bitcoin to purchase greater amounts of surplus energy for its own sake? The answer here is that there are real market forces that prevent Bitcoin's energy demands from running away forever. Miners are highly sensitive to the price of electricity and will simply turn off when rates go too high. Profitability for miners is a moving target and by no means guaranteed. Further, at some point, the availability of mining hardware, the chips themselves, becomes a limiting factor in how much energy the network can consume. The combination of these factors creates natural cycles in network hash rate and is a testament to the self-regulating nature of markets. Coinciding with the energy transition is a monetary transition that marks the end of the Bretton Woods era of banking that began in 1944. How do we know the world is due for a monetary reset? Well, we've already discussed the USA's rise to prominence in the 20th century and the accompanying dollar hegemony. Today we see a shifting landscape with regard to monetary authority. There have been major geopolitical developments that call into question the dollar's status as world reserve currency. Fed Chair Jerome Powell has even stated he doesn't rule out the possibility of a multipolar world with more than one reserve currency. That's quite a shift in policy stance compared to the prevailing view that U.S. Treasuries are the safest asset in the world. That the Fed is repeatedly forced to prop up markets in treasuries, overnight lending, etc., is indicative of an American default in slow motion, and the response of our adversaries to weaponize commodities and supply chains is in essence calling our bluff. Dollar hegemony and a large navy helped the U.S. secure cheap imports in the past. Now the result of the winding down of decades-long monetary profligacy is in a way a return of price signals that had been made artificially stable. The splintering of global order and a swing back in the direction of American isolationism will entail a reconfiguring of supply chains that had been stretched beyond the point of systemic fragility. In a report for Credit Suisse, the professional banker Zoltan Posar gave a sobering commentary on the state of the dollar in the first half of 2022. The insight that came out of this memo is that economic sanctions on Russia, while justified, likely have knock-on effects to the financial system, including an erosion of trust in existing monetary authorities, leading countries like Russia to place a renewed emphasis on commodity-based monies. The resulting dichotomy is summed up in the observation that countries dependent on, quote, inside money, such as US dollars, are liable to having the rug pulled should they get on the wrong side of sanctions, whereas, quote, outside money, like commodities, offer increased sovereignty and greater protection against financial censorship. The downside to monetizing commodities is that price increases on food and energy end up squeezing those populations already living hand to mouth. Bitcoin is outside money because it's immune from censorship and debasement by the state. Bitcoin actually makes for a better money than things like gold, oil, and real estate because its only job is to be money, and so sidesteps those harmful effects of monetizing industrial commodities. Fiat currency, of course, can only ever be inside money, which means the system might work for you as long as you're on the inside, and if not, then you'd better find some new friends. all banking has effectively been subsumed by international shadow banking, which is opaque by its very nature. There's no backing and no reserves. It's all credit, promises passed back and forth, and settlement is never final. Like musical chairs, bankruptcy is baked in, as are bubbles, crises of all shapes and sizes, and of course bailouts. When we speak of bailouts, it appears the referee has stepped onto the field to become one with the player. When industry, public policy, and banking are all in bed together, then objectivity goes out the window and cronyism is the only game left. This is the world we've inherited, and yet Bitcoin has managed to rise up through the swamp to call time out on the charades. Like the pull of gravity, or like the club owner who turns on the lights on a dance floor full of drunk people, Bitcoin is the reckoning that chickens do come home to roost. Metaphors aside, the point is that Bitcoin allows the very objectivity needed for markets to function. In fact, Bitcoin demands objectivity because the truth is defined every 10 minutes. The ledger acts as the third entry beside the existing debits and credits. Except here, no one's cooking the books. You either have the coin or you don't. And the indisputable link to reality places real constraints on capital allocation to a degree that's otherwise lacking, absent the option to hold outside money. Bitcoin is the reset. A key example of ceaseless debt monetization is the case of Japan, who has conducted several episodes of QE since the early 2000s. While making causal inferences in a complex system is often speculative, we can observe the economics and demographics of Japan today as a potential model of what could happen when debt monetization is taken to the extreme. The Pacific nation's economic outlook is somewhat idiosyncratic due to geography and culture, etc. So drawing comparisons between the US and Japan is complicated. The documentary Princes of the Yen takes a much deeper look at Japan's financial system than I can possibly do justice here. Suffice to say that when the central bank becomes the sole owner of its home country's debt, the logical result is price fixing of government bonds at every maturity, also known as yield curve control. When free market signals are squeezed out of the economy by monetary aristocrats, the ripple effects are felt throughout an increasingly artificial economy. In lieu of singling out Japan's state and banking officials for its approach to monetary policy, we should recognize the Bank of Japan is likely influenced by a larger international banking cartel with more macroscopic aims. In the midst of growing financial uncertainty, it's nice to be able to use a free and open network that respects property rights and voluntary exchange, that's recognized and adopted globally with no gatekeepers or central planners. That reality already exists today in Bitcoin. It's our responsibility as individuals to decide whether that's the world we want to live in. The Bitcoin standard happens one person at a time. Don't expect to wake up and see everything suddenly priced in sats, as long as you're complicit with the old system. Vote with your wallet. Only through individuals acting of their own accord do we see incremental change that carries weight for the future. With a renewed emphasis on outside commodity money, many people wonder what role, if any, gold will have in the coming years. And my answer is that I wouldn't lose sleep over it. Hypothetically, would you value a gold coin or jewelry more than a lump of coal? If yes, then that should be some small assurance that gold remains relevant. Then again, it might depend on whether you're broke or cold in that particular moment. Just making a coal joke. Whether gold serves as collateral in central banking is less certain. Because why go to the hassle of hoarding gold in vaults when currency is entirely dematerialized, existing only in ledgers? Unlike the first paper certificates, there's nothing physical to be redeemed with a unit of currency. It can only be spent. When all else fails, people come up with creative ways of keeping track of ownership. Like in prison, packs of cigarettes acquire a monetary value because they're fungible and not easily debased. In regions of Africa, people have taken to treating cell phone minutes as tradable tokens, which is interesting. Imperfect as these examples are, they easily serve as mediums of exchange in the absence of something better. The fact that cigarettes or mobile minutes would achieve some monetary legitimacy apart from their original function is a natural, though unintended, consequence of a financial system in disarray. It should be in everyone's interest to ensure society doesn't devolve into chaotic bartering or persistent commodity crises, as foretold by the Zoltan, due to a loss of faith in national currencies. Ideally, the dollar doesn't become so onerous and contrived as to lose any shred of integrity. Meanwhile, people retain the freedom and dignity to opt into using an incorruptible and privacy-preserving method of saving and value exchange when it suits them. Zoltan's outside money will find a way to proliferate parallel to the confines of state-issued currency. The more readily we can find consensus on the meaning and value of such outside money, the stronger and more reliable such a network can become. Bitcoin has been an answer to the call for an outside money since 2009. It doesn't have to be the last of its kind, but it can be a stepping stone into a future of financial innovation built on principles and integrity. I hinted earlier at the systemic effects of passive fund investing. The space of competing fund managers has become dominated by 2 or 3 giant firms that together hold client assets on the order of trillions. These firms then become some of the largest shareholders of the largest companies, giving them power to influence corporate decision-making. Nothing is more evident of a coordinated attempt to exert economic power than the remarkable speed of convergence and social buy-in of ESG. Because periods of monetary expansion tend to benefit stock market performance, investment funds are further enriched by the implicit backstop of the Fed. So putting the pieces together, it becomes clear that control of the source of money breeds control of the economy and hence control of jobs and labor. Similarly, to control the money is to control the funding of research and hence the control of information, media, and public opinion. The logical endpoint of systematic top-down social organization is the digital panopticon, and for exemplary models of modern authoritarianism, we need only look to China and North Korea. The tools of these regimes are capital controls, financial surveillance, and social credit. The outcomes are increased class separation, erosion of the social fabric, wealth disparity, and genocide. Since 2020, perhaps sooner, there's been a push in the West to redefine the social contract in the interest of the greater good, and this has included attacks on freedom and autonomy and attacks on the U.S. Constitution, which would be unthinkable had we not already canceled our white and bigoted founding fathers. I have a different view that, in fact, America belongs to the explorers, to the builders, and the cowboys who said, "Come and take it," in the face of government overreach. The political, academic, and media elite instead do the work of unelected central planners, financed by the money printer, who sincerely think entire peoples and nations can be mobilized like pieces on a chessboard. It's important for us to reflect on and examine the relationship of individuals and families to the state, to the financial system, and to the media. What starts as messages of compassion for the greater good, in the wrong hands, morphs into a system that optimizes for obedience. Political dissidents are labeled enemies of the state and terrorists. The erosion of freedom is a slippery slope, where ground is given up 1 inch at a time until there's nothing left to give. This is relevant in the degree to which we've given up personal control of data and digital media. Eventually, you'll have no control, only permission to access the data you've forfeited or outsourced out of convenience unaware that your beloved tech was designed to surveil. Only those who say no have a chance at clawing back their own human rights. And Bitcoin is just one of the tools that gives us the ability to short-circuit what could almost certainly lead to totalitarian rule, which is why sharing the knowledge and skills of sovereign computing is one of the most compassionate things we can do. I think the answer to the pessimism and helplessness that I've expressed with regard to tyranny is a need to strengthen family ties and education, to rekindle our search for faith and spirituality, and to adopt our own core value framework for evaluating the uncertain paths forward. These things can't be provided by government and central planners, despite their attempt at posturing over social good and duty to the planet. And the reason the state can't be relied on as the source of human values is that the actions of government typically reflect a need to stay in power by shaping social organization. In other words, government is more concerned with maintaining the hierarchy than promoting prosperity. So public policies, however virtuous they appear, can only produce hypocritical outcomes. Equity, inclusion, radical empathy, and an insistence on niceness are all flowery prose that often results in a homogeneous population of non-thinking laborers. In the theory of Karl Marx, labor is the fundamental commodity and not capital. And this is a philosophy I would push back on vehemently because, while fairness and equity sounds great, it's equity of opportunity we should want and not equality of outcome. The historical precedent for this philosophy is a populace that's gradually squeezed of its autonomy, and free market entrepreneurs are replaced by authoritarians. I tend to squirm when I hear terms like public-private partnership because it legitimizes the encroachment of government. Some people may gravitate, consciously or not, to a system that emphasizes safety and equality, like an earnest disciple lured by the promise of salvation by a cult of personality. Others have viscerally reeled in the opposite direction by renouncing the illusion of safety and embracing the uncertainty and often hostility of the real world, where at least we're free to speak our mind and apply our talents in new and creative ways, where innovation is rewarded by the market when it serves to drive progress. As computers, communication, and internet technology gained traction, the world was thrust into the information age perhaps faster than we were able to cope with it. The internet was a sort of singularity in itself, and that the world before and after global connectivity is nearly unrecognizable. Since the new millennium, we've experienced a range of collective growing pains wherein the human mind and culture at large have struggled to catch up to a rapidly changing technological landscape. Nevertheless, we're on the right path, that is, the path of scientific progress. Although at times messy and prone to fits and starts, it's the path that brought us here through the course of evolution and will also be the way forward. But we have to be willing to grow alongside the growth of information and new technical paradigms, which means leaving behind old concepts that no longer serve us. Science is a method of discovery and not a tool of propaganda. It depends on reason and rationality, reproducibility, and falsifiability. Scientific authority, if there is such a thing, is not immune to scrutiny. If anything, authority is especially susceptible to attack when it's in the interest of progress and understanding. Faith in the scientific method is philosophically worlds away from a faith or trust in a singular scientific claim. One study does not a scientific finding make. So with that out of the way, let's look at some of the ways technology will contribute to the transition to a hyper-advanced civilization. The work of Cathie Wood and others at ARK investment funds provide a solid framework for understanding disruptive technology. Of particular note are the growing fields of genetics and medicine, AI and robotics, Bitcoin and financial tech, batteries and EVs, and of course space. It's expected that progress in any one of these sectors will bleed over into other industries, creating a flywheel effect like a tide of innovation that lifts all boats. For example, the space frontier, which is a remarkably challenging environment, has been a source of innovation that would be previously inconceivable. Space is a testing ground for things like solar energy and unconventional propulsion, pushing the limits of the human body and automation. All of these have had significant ramifications to the way we live. AI and robotics, combined with material science, are opening new avenues into within medicine and biotech. And as digital communication becomes ubiquitous and more devices come online, an Internet of Things will require an Internet of Value. Bitcoin as an Internet protocol is the commonly spoken language when it comes to paving the way for global commerce in the information age. To think automation will gradually remove today's needs for human labor is not a reason to sit on the couch, but rather a call to level up our skills and have an influence on shaping what that world looks like. At the end of the day, the computers need to be told what to do and where to go. And the skills and knowledge required to interface with advanced systems should be democratized to the greatest extent possible, or else we're prone to producing fewer centers of control, shrouded in thick bureaucracy. Education, transparency, and freedom of information are critical pieces to this endeavor. On the other hand, central and hierarchical control of data and algorithms is a trend over which we should be hypervigilant. Not that big data is a threat in itself, but because of what governments can do when surveillance is taken to the extreme. There's a tendency to collect vast amounts of population data and then believe we can manipulate the outcomes by enacting policy measures like fine-tuning the slices of a pie chart. There's a danger in taking this approach because it neglects the human element, the need to feel free and unencumbered to pursue one's own happiness. The way to effect lasting change is instead by empowering people to change themselves and thereby embody the change we want to see. Much is at stake as we move into the next phase of humanity, and there aren't many second chances at creating a world that values property, privacy, and peace. The path to authoritarianism tends to be a one-way street. It's no surprise we see a backlash toward globalism, perhaps ironically shared among people across the globe. So in a way, achieving a globally cooperative economy is a bit like threading a needle. A step too far in the direction of control is met with the wrath of populism. Yet, I'm hopeful that the kinds of transitions we embark on will bring cooperation on the scale we've never seen. Think of what we've already accomplished with communication, decentralized money, and a common yearning for the stars. These are fundamentally collective accomplishments, and there's something to be said for that. So as we grow out of the old ways of self-organizing, what then should redefining the social contract look like? It should look like a further dissolving of boundaries rather than walling people off from one another, gatekeeping of information and means of exchange. Governments should exist to serve people and not the other way around. We should be quick to disband and discard centralized control and move cautiously and thoughtfully when forming new institutions and policies. By placing value on personal autonomy, speech, and mobility, and by promoting the flourishing of local communities, that will breed collective prosperity. To close the loop on the energy discussion, the hope of advanced technical and societal progress will require energy and lots of it. In the scheme of geologic time, there may be only a small window in which humans can either unlock abundance and reach out toward the stars, or else succumb to any number of existential threats and risk being thrust back into the dark ages. There's no guarantee we've already passed this proverbial great filter and that it's not still ahead of us. Our collective goal, then, should be to avoid as many scenarios as possible that would present such a filter on intelligence and thereby live to see the other side of it, in which humans achieve mastery of the Earth's system. The goal of sustainability was never to use less energy. It's about unlocking energy on the scale that will propel the next phase of evolution. even to say we need to reduce carbon is missing the larger point, which is why I've intentionally tried to avoid discussing CO2 in particular, because it's a poor framing. If we assume the Earth's climate is influenced by human activity, then the prospect of tackling climate change implies we have the ability to terraform the Earth toward desired ends. And if that's the case, then why stop at CO2? Why not design the optimal Earth system from the ocean floor to the edge of space? That most likely sounds far-fetched to us right now, but if we plan to achieve energy mastery on a planetary scale, then we need to start thinking bigger. This future might turn out to be much more complex than we think, if not practically impossible, barring significant technological revolutions that are as yet inconceivable. But that's not to say we shouldn't try. In any case, we should be careful not to trivialize the planet's complexity, for example, by assuming one gaseous molecule acts as the control knob of the Earth's temperature. Surely that's an oversimplification. All I'm saying is let's zoom out and gain a holistic perspective of where humans want to get to technologically, even if that future appears like science fiction today. What would we be without the innate gifts of imagination and foresight and a level of resolve that transcends a single lifetime? Success in the information age and in the dawning space age will require creative thinking, bravery, and curiosity. Don't fall into the trap of believing you'll be safe in a crowd of silence, because that's precisely what enabled the witch trials, the Inquisition, and so many unspeakable atrocities. Remember instead the pilgrims, the pioneers, and the cowboys who were willing to lay it all on the line for hope of a better future.